Welcome to Assembly Calendar. I'm Mike Friesen. With us for our program today, Assemblyman Bob Oaks. Bob Oaks represents the 130th Assembly District in New York State. That's an Assembly District that includes Wayne, Cayuga, and Oswego counties. And we thank you folks all across the area for joining us for this program today. Bob Oaks, it's nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Mike.
We've got lots to get caught up on. It is budget week as we tape this program at the state capitol. We'll be talking with Bob Oaks, who is the ranking member on the Assembly Ways and Means Committee and is kind of knee-deep in those budget talks himself. We'll ask him about how things are shaping up and what they're going to look like and might impact on you folks that are watching. The other interesting thing about your busyness of late, Bob Oaks, is you're coming off a whole series of town hall meetings all across your Assembly District area.
Well, you mentioned the counties, Oswego, Cayuga, and Wayne. In each of those counties, I did some town meetings, some regionally focused meetings just to sit down with constituents, talk to them about what their concerns are, what their issues were. Very honestly, very good response from people. Did them on a set of them on evening and a set of them on a Saturday all day. And, a number of people were there concerned about funding in this year's budget, local school districts, local libraries were there in force, I would say, around the district. But also people just of general interest, just wanting to know what's going on, or some people with a problem that they might have, wondering if I might help. And so I have a staff person or two go along as well, so they might follow up while I'm heading off to the next meeting. And so overall, a very good response from people. Also, people raised issues, very honestly, on the federal level. Different things. There's a lot of uncertainty.
Right.
What's Washington going to do with tax reform? What about health care? What about the environment? Some of those issues. And so overall, a good exchange with people that I represent throughout the 130th district.
And it's all interconnected. What happens in Washington, for example, with health care, will have some impact on the budgeting in Albany, because you're going to have to make some adjustments too based on whatever Washington does, right?
But the reality is a lot of their questions, there aren't answers to at this point, because as we saw in Washington, there's not a set plan of where things are headed. So one of the things that was highlighted to me, both by economists who came and spoke to us when we were looking at trying to figure out what the revenue forecast might be for the budget, they were ending up saying, the timetable is a lot of things that might happen might not impact the 2017 and 18 state budget as much as it might be the 2018, 2019 and beyond. And so, again, a lot of questions, but it's always good to have face-to-face and opportunity for people to talk directly to their elected representatives.
And I bet there were very few questions asked that somehow wouldn't be applicable to the budget process itself that I referred to at the top of the program, because everything has a dollar figure attached to it, and that all has to be filtered through the budget process. Here at the state capitol, you folks know the governor starts off each year with his budget proposal. He hands that to the legislature, and then they ask a lot of questions of the governor's commissioners and things like that. And then the Assembly puts a budget proposal together. The Senate puts one together. You got three on the table, and that's where the negotiations are right now, all coming together with knowing what everyone's priorities are. When the Assembly put together its budget proposal that came out on the floor for passage, Bob Oaks stood up and talked on that. That was the Assembly Majority's budget proposal. Bob Oaks is a member of the Assembly Minority Party's Ways and Means Committee, ranking member on that. So he had some concerns. Let's take a look and a listen as to what he said that day as part of his debate, and we'll be back to talk more with Bob Oaks on Assembly Calendar.
And so what we have is the cap being pushed by the governor himself, and then we're also having here today seeing that the Assembly proposal would blow through that cap. I think what that says for the future is we could put ourselves in real fiscal stress in this state unless we continue to adhere to a more responsible spending level. We already we heard the tax proposals. We already have a large portion of our state budget. Up to 40% of the personal income tax is paid by 1% of the taxpayers in New York State. What this budget and proposal would do by the Assembly majority is increase the rates, extend the millionaire's tax, and then increase the rates on the highest of earners in the state. And while that might seem to be a good way and a solution in the short term to fund the programs and needed resources and provide the needed resources of the state, this only makes us more dependent on a fewer number of people. And as we become more dependent, we become more susceptible to another day that the revenues of this state, if there's an economic downturn, the revenues of this state will tank and will be in this chamber looking for ways to try to take dollars back from the very programs that we're all trying to be committed to and support. And so, looking at the overall spending, looking at the overall ways of trying to get the revenue, and then thinking about increasing the debt at a greater rate than the spending by almost 6%, the fact that it doesn't include ride sharing as the proposal, which I think has widespread support.
This is a wish list, right? This is what the Assembly majority says, boy, if we could get everything in our budget, this is what we'd get. That pretty much
that would be fair.
A good summation of that?
That would be fair, and as I was talking there, if we were to adopt that, the spending of this state, both this year and in the future,
through the moon.
Right. And you know, one of the things that Governor Cuomo came in, he had a very tough budget. Revenues had been tanking. We were in recession. He ended up really pulling back spending in the state and then putting in a self-imposed 2% cap on growth over future years. And that's something, as the Assembly Minority Conference, we've been proposing to just put that into law, to have a law that would say you can't spend more year to year to an excess. And you know, back in the Governor Spitzer era, his first budget 11% above the year before, and his second budget, which he never got a chance to get finally passed, but it was so far down the line, another 8% above. So we're spending like this. We run out of resources, and the resources actually went down. We were in a mess. My fear is what the Assembly is trying to push, and actually the governor this year, because he's using a number of gimmicks to try to fund or not count certain resources against that cap. We just, I was cautioning there, we need to protect our overall budget, because if we spend too fast, we're going to, the only way to make it is to then raise taxes. And as I was saying there again, you raise it on the highest earners. We are over 40%. What the Assembly budget would do is actually push that more to 50% of our total income tax coming from just a few earners at the high end of the spectrum.
So we're taping this program in the final few days of March. The budget is due to be in place in just a few days, but we're still, the negotiations are ongoing. Budget bills are starting to pass. You had the first one come through. It's known as the debt service bill. This is basically just the idea that whatever debt the state has, the bill's coming due on it. You got to be paying on that. And that's what this authorizes. But you stood up and said, again, you had concerns. You got to pay the bill. You were going to vote for it. But you had some concerns about if the spending gets bigger and we're going to have more debt, these payments are just going to get bigger and the state's kind of heading in the wrong direction. Let's go back to the floor of the Assembly with Bob Oaks.
This bill is, as we've talked about, the first in the series of budget bills to get this process going, that hopefully we will see many more in the coming days here. But today we're talking about paying the debt or the debt payments on the debt that we've already incurred for this state, not that we are going to be taking on more by our action today. What we will be looking at in those bills coming up before us in future days is the consideration whether or not to incur a greater amount of debt for the state. It's my intention today to vote in favor of this bill. It is also my concern, though, that we look at those future bills that we might consider and be cautious about incurring greater amounts of debt for this state, that we will probably be looking at higher rates that would put a greater burden on our taxpayers. Certainly, the more we can reduce that debt, we can control that debt, it allows the dollars and the resources of this state to be used for the programs that are needed, that today we may think if we borrow for them, we can have them today, but if we don't perhaps borrow as much, we have greater dollars to fund with the resources coming in right then to pay for the programs that are needed and the services. So again, Mr. Speaker, I'll be voting in favor of this bill today, and look forward to the future pieces of legislation to complete this budget process in the coming days. Thank you.
The future pieces of legislation that, again, we still don't know.
Haven't seen them.
Haven't seen them, but there's a lot of ideas floating around out there. The governor with his free college tuition, and the Assembly majority wanting the DREAM Act, which is educational aid for illegal alien families, and all. There's all sorts of things on the table out there, and now it's just kind of wait and see as to what the final product looks like.
There's workers' comp reform,
right?
Hoping for the ride-sharing issues. Always the issues of where do we end up with education funding, support for our local libraries. Also, you know, the impact of the minimum wage. There was that's increased again this year. It will again next year. We put a small piece in to help farming community. That's being discussed of anything more that we might do in tax credits for employers in the agricultural community. And so a number of things out there on the table. I would say some of them won't be in the final budget. And in fact, I don't really like doing major policy shift, raise the age, how we're going to handle criminal justice issues related to 16 and 17-year-olds. That has a budget impact, but is that where policy ought to be finalized? So all of those things are moving. I would say that there's progress being made on the budget, but there are no agreements that have been really finalized. And so we sit here just a few days today, taping this a few days before April 1st, with a requirement that you're supposed to have a bill aged for 3 days before the legislature considers it. It's looking very slim that we will be doing a budget that way this year. We'll probably get messages of necessity from the governor, which means you can vote on something very quickly. I don't think that's the best way to do the budget. I don't think it's a great way for the people of New York State to have their business done. But this is a $152 billion budget, big issues. We need to have as much time and input on that as possible.
You'll be cramming like college students the night before the big final, except the textbooks that you will be having to go through will be like this tall, stacks of paper.
You got it.
Bob Oaks, thanks for joining us. We will be back in touch with you to find out how this budget process all plays out here at the state capitol. We hope you folks will be joining us for that. It'll be on our next edition of Assembly Calendar.